Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. This is session number 12 on Alice's Adventures. Tonight, we're going to look at chapter 3 of Through the Looking Glass. We got as far as Alice's conversation with the Red Queen last time, and tonight we are going to get through past the Looking Glass insects. I hope that's the goal, and through up to, but not including Tweedledum and Tweedledee, as she is going to leap forward and be, well, almost halfway to becoming a queen by the end of tonight's class, as she's going to be hastening through square number 3 by train. But anyway, as I say, we will get to that stuff. A quick reminder, our fall moot season is almost coming to an end, but we have one last moot remaining, and that is SoCal Moot down in Carlsbad, California, and that is going to be next weekend. So 10 days from now, on the 5th of November, is SoCal Moot in Carlsbad. So if you can go, you go to our events page on our Signum University website, and you can still register. We've gotten a bunch of registrations for folks who want to come join us on site, and of course you can still register to participate remotely. This moot, as all of them are, will be a fully hybrid moot. So that is where we're going to be, and there we are. So looking forward to SoCal Moot. And then, as I say, that will end our fall moot season, and we will be moving then forward into the spring. The Brisbane Moot, Oz Moot, which is indeed the next moot after that, is going to be in January. It's the last weekend in January. So you can, I'm not sure exactly when we have to close registration for that, but I don't think particularly early. I haven't heard anything about closing that one particularly early, so you should still be able to register for a bit. And yes, Jocelyn, I am coming out to SoCal. I'll be in Carlsbad next weekend. I'm not going to be spending a whole lot of time there in SoCal, but I'll be there. I'll be there next weekend. Looking forward to that. All right, but without further delay, as I've already been delayed here this evening, let me push through into tonight's slides, as we didn't quite get through chapter 2 last time, so I want to finish that up. We got right to the part where the Red Queen and Alice start running. "Now, now," cried the Queen, "faster, faster!" And they went so fast that at last they seemed to skim through the air, hardly touching the ground with their feet, till suddenly, just as Alice was getting quite exhausted, they stopped, and she found herself sitting on the ground, breathless and giddy. The Queen propped her up against a tree and said kindly, "You may rest a little now." Alice looked round her in great surprise. "Why, I do believe we've been under this tree the whole time. Everything's just as it was." "Of course it is," said the Queen. "What would you have it?" "Well, in our country," said Alice, still panting a little, "you'd generally get to somewhere else if you ran very fast for a long time, as we've been doing." "A slow sort of country," said the Queen. "Now here, you see, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that." Okay, now, of course, there are several kind of jokes going on here, right? One is merely the fact that this is the Queen, the Red Queen that we're talking about, right? The chest piece which moves most and fastest. So the Red Queen, of course, is very swift and agile, and we'll see the Queen's moving fast later on. But notice the similarity between this trend here, and the directional thing, right? In order to get to the hill, you've got to turn around and walk in the opposite direction of it. If you try to walk towards it, you will end up getting to exactly where you don't want to get, which, of course, in Alice's case, was back inside the house. But if you turn and go towards the house, then you'll end up at the hill. Here, similarly, if you want to stay where you are, you've got to set off running very fast. And if you stay where you are, if you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that. It takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place, the Queen says. Now, this is a little puzzling, of course, as we don't, in fact, see that being true in other cases, right? She wasn't having to continue running, right, the whole time in order to stay there talking to the flowers, right? She was standing in front of the flower bed. She wasn't being swept off somewhere, right, because she was standing still. So we do not see this as consistently true. The Queen dismisses Alice's country as a slow sort of country, and I agree, Fourth Dauntless, that I think one of the things that we're seeing here is this kind of inversion that we have associated with Looking Glass world already, right? It's still not exactly, she's not finding that, like, when she goes to turn left, she finds she's accidentally turned right. That's the kind of thing I would sort of first expect in Looking Glass country, right? If everything is mirror reversed. And she hasn't, and I don't think she ever confuses right and left, again, as you would expect her to do in sort of mirror reverse land. But anyway, so that I think is kind of an interesting thing, and it suggests to me that there's something sort of deeper going on here, right? More than just a simple mirror reversal of things. First Fish, I agree, that does seem to be an interesting correlation. This isn't quite First Fish says the inversions only work when you look for it. When she's not paying attention, it doesn't happen. Yes, it's only when she is setting out with the intention of going to a particular place, like going to the hill or going to meet the Red Queen, that she finds herself going in the wrong direction. It's only when she is running with the Red Queen and expecting to get somewhere else, as in her defense, one generally does do. If you run very fast for a long time, you generally get to somewhere else. That certainly seems true. But when she's expecting that is when she finds that she doesn't. Looks around her in surprise and realizes they've been under this tree the whole time. But again, she wasn't aware of that before that point. Like, as they were running, she didn't have the experience of running really fast while nothing seemed to move around her, right? So anyway, so that I think is more sort of evidence, I think, First Fish, in support of your observation there, that it has as much to do with her will and her sort of, I don't know what, her assessment of things, right? When she's thinking about it, when she's assessing things, they don't seem to work the way that she thinks. Yes. Yeah. And JJ, I agree. It's not a perfect inversion here either. Otherwise, as JJ points out, one might expect that in order to get somewhere, one would have to stay still. And that's not what the Queen says. In order to get somewhere, you have to run at least twice as fast as that. What we see, so again, it's not exactly an inversion. There is an inversion-ish element to it, right? Like things not working as they're expected to, things working even, in a sense, in an opposite way to their expected. What I think we begin to see here is a question of cause and effect first, right? It's the cause and effect that Alice points out. If you run very fast for a long time, you generally get to somewhere else, right? The result of that action. In fact, it seems, the logic of that seems so obvious that it seems almost like a tautology, right? If you run very fast for a long time, you generally go somewhere, right? Like if you're going somewhere, you get somewhere is generally what you would expect to happen. But no, that would be a slow sort of country. What she says here is what she implies. Notice what she's done. She was saying before that when you say hill, I've seen hills compared with this, compared with which you would call this a valley. And Alice said, no, I would not. That's a contradiction. That's no hill could be so much larger than this hill that it would make this hill into a valley. A valley is something quite different. That would be nonsense. And what the Queen is suggesting here is basically that she can run so fast that, when you say running, right, I can do running compared with which the running that you've just been doing would be standing still. See how that would work? It's almost exactly parallel to the kinds of claims that she was making before, which Alice rejected as nonsense on the same premise, right? I mean, again, like by definition, yeah, one hill may be very much smaller than another hill, but the question is it going up or is it going down, right? If it's going down, it's a valley. If it's going up, it's a hill. I don't care how large it is. It's not about scale. It's about direction, right? Similarly, yeah, okay, one person might run very, very much faster than another person, right? So you could have very slow speed and very fast speed, but either you're standing still or you're not standing still. Either you're getting somewhere, you're not getting somewhere. It wouldn't seem to work like that, and yet the Queen shows. The Queen is sort of doing an "I told you so" without even explaining it, right? They are living out, she compels Alice to kind of live out together an instance of precisely the kind of thing that she was talking about before. So in fact, it seems that, again, it's that premise. Alice's rigid premise, which seemed perfectly sensible. It seemed like the opposite of nonsense. Alice's claims, right? That it would be nonsense to call a hill a valley, no matter how small it is. That's nonsense. That is a contradiction to the meaning of the words. Just as it would be a contradiction to the meaning of the words to say you can run for a very long time and remain in the same place at the same time, right? That's not possible. That's nonsense. That's a contradiction to like what the word run means, right? Or what sort of traveling means. And you remember, of course, the Queen's final comparison, right? You may call it nonsense, but I have heard nonsense compared with which that was as sensible as a dictionary. A dictionary which tells you exactly what words mean, right? Which attaches particular meanings to particular words and says this word means that and no other thing. What nonsense is to the Queen is such that Alice would call that thing which Alice called nonsense, which is calling a hill a valley, right? That it would be as sensible as a dictionary, but it's exactly on the dictionary premise. That is, that the word hill cannot mean the same thing as valley. You cannot use those two words interchangeably for a given thing, no matter what. And that's exactly what the Queen asserts she would do, right? I mean, if she could hear the real nonsense, right, that the Queen herself has heard. As that conversation went on, the Queen sounded merely more and more stubborn and more silly, I think. And yet now we see the Queen's right. At least here, she seems to be right. I mean, I don't know about the hills and valleys. I guess that perhaps it's true. Perhaps it's true. But in this case, we see an illustration of exactly the thing that she was talking about. Don't assume you know how things work. Don't assume you know what names mean. And this is where, again, I think what looked at first like a mere inversion, in order to go that way instead, which, again, has that sense of mirror inversion, right? The kind of thing you'd expect in Looking Glass Land. Turns out very quickly to be quite different, and much more complicated. About the Red Queen is about calling into question. I mean, one of the things that she's doing is calling into question the very meaning of words, the concept of definitions. Remember, she does almost exactly, she does a similar thing. Alice is hot and thirsty, and the Queen gives her a biscuit. Now, from the sound of it, this sounds like a, I'm imagining it's like a cracker, like a saltine or something like that. Some very dry cracker, which almost chokes Alice to eat it. And the Queen says, thirst quenched? From eating this very dry biscuit, which Alice can barely choke down. And Alice can't even get the word no out of her mouth because she's so, her mouth is so dry and choked up with the dry cracker when she was very thirsty. Once again, but again, you see the same sort of thing, right? She didn't get the chance. The Queen doesn't get the chance to say, like, I have seen biscuits so dry that you would call that a glass of water, right? And yet, it seems to be similar. I know a biscuit is a cookie in England, Arthur, but again, that's not the context I'm getting from this. From what Alice is doing. I mean, it's possible she's getting a very dry cookie of some sort. But yes, it is clearly to Alice the opposite of a treat, especially for one who is very thirsty. I'm not sure exactly what in Carol's time would have been invoked by the concept of biscuit. But I don't know. But I'm wondering if that usage may have shifted some. This would be an interesting inquiry. Really, this passage is the first one that has made me wonder this. That is the history of the use of the word biscuit. And I can't help but think, for instance, that when I think backwards a bit further to the 18th century, 1700s, of course, the word biscuit tends to be used of the kind of dry, unleavened cracker bread that was used on board ships. Ship's biscuit, which, again, very, very dry, rather flavorless, unleavened bread. That was called biscuit. So we're right in between the modern usage of biscuit as cookie and the older usage, at least 18th century, maybe it was still used that way in the 19th century as well, where biscuit meant, cram, basically, bricktails. Exactly. So I'm not sure. Again, when it's not explained to us, all this time later, exactly what it is the Queen hands her. But it's clearly something at least that dry. Arthur, I really like unleavened bread too. Arthur, one of my friends in college once told me that you could tell I wasn't Jewish because I loved matzah so much. But anyway, I quite enjoy unleavened bread myself, but probably not if it were handed me like this when I was extremely out of breath and thirsty. But anyway, we will see. Again, I don't think it's a treat. So even a dry cookie doesn't seem to me to fit with Alice's reaction exactly. But anyway, so, okay, let's see. So again, I'm looking at the big picture here. what we see is within Looking Glass world, it's more than just opposite country. It's a place where the link between like words and meanings are starting to break down, and we'll see that continuing to be sort of developed as we move forward through into chapter 2. One last thing on chapter 2 before into chapter 3. One last thing in chapter 2 before we leave it. The Queen's anticipations of what are to come. This is going to be important for us to keep in mind. She gives us a summary of the rest of the plot of the book. So the Queen goes and she's putting those pegs in the ground, predicting what she is going to go and say, right? So she's laying out precisely, and notice how peculiar this is. She's going to tell Alice what is going to happen in the future. And in order to do that, she first makes a meta prediction, right, of what she's going to say at what place. So she scripts her own speech in advance, warning Alice in advance what she's going to do. And then she goes and does it. And the thing that she does when she acts out the thing that she just scripted is to tell about what's going to happen in the future, right? So it is sort of very elaborately laid out. It gives it the sense of greater certainty, right? Because we are told precisely what she is going to say when she gets to these points. So anyway, she had got all the pegs put in by this time, and Alice looked on with great interest as she returned to the tree and then began slowly walking down the row. At the 2-yard peg, she faced round and said, "A pawn goes 2 squares in its first move, you know. So you'll go very quickly through the 3rd square, by railway, I should think, and you'll find yourself in the 4th square in no time. Well, that square belongs to Tweedledum and Tweedledee. The 5th is mostly water. The 6th belongs to Humpty Dumpty. But you make no remark?" I didn't know I had to make one just then," Alice faltered out. "You should have said," the Queen went on in a tone of grave reproof. "It's extremely kind of you to tell me all this. However, we'll suppose it said. The 7th square is all forest. However, one of the knights will show you the way. And in the 8th square we shall be queens together, and it's all feasting and fun." Alice got up and curtsied, and sat down again. At the next peg, the Queen turned again, and this time she said, "Speak in French when you can't think of the English for a thing. Turn out your toes as you walk, and remember who you are." She did not wait for Alice to curtsy this time, but walked on quickly to the next peg, where she turned for a moment to say "Goodbye," and then hurried on to the last. Okay. So, first of all, did you catch what happened in the middle there? Alice is so mesmerized by watching the Queen play out the script that she's made with the pegs, right? She not only just put the pegs in the ground to announce the spots where she was going. She said, I will walk here, and then I will say this. When I get to this point, I will say this other thing. And when I get to this point, I will say this other thing. And she's watching this script unfold. And in the middle of it, the Queen says, "But you make no remark?" And Alice says, I didn't know I had to make one just then. That is, she didn't realize she was in the script. She was watching it unfold the way the Queen said. The Queen didn't give her instructions. She didn't know she was part of the script, that she was supposed to. I mean, I had a line? I didn't know I had a line, right? Seems to be the kind of thing. That's how I understand Alice's faltering comment there. But of course, the Queen's reproof to her merely says, "You should have said it's extremely kind of you to tell me all this." That is, that would indeed have been the polite thing to say to someone there. And saying the polite thing, giving the polite response, like knowing when to say please and thank you, and knowing when you ought to say it's extremely kind of you to tell me all this, that is part of a script, right? Part of the social script of politeness. But that seemed to have been quite different from what the kind of script that the Queen was putting into place. And, the Queen moves on, however we'll suppose it said, right? Let's, because of course, you see the joke there, it was just said, the Queen said it herself, right? The Queen is acting out both parts. Oh, hey, she's pretending to be more than one person at once, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Burigida. Yeah. His contractions are quite literal. If you think about it, it actually makes a great deal of sense. There's more than one letter left out when he spells can't. He doesn't say CAN apostrophe T. That has the apostrophe substitute for two letters. He tends to do this can't and shan't and things. He apostrophizes oddly. It was idiosyncratic. He did not gain many adherents who are willing to put multiple apostrophes in these words for greater precision. But there it was. Okay, now right. So Alice, in watching this peculiar performance by the Red Queen, who herself, the Red Queen that is, has announced it to be a performance, finds herself caught on the hop because of not realizing she would be part of it. That mixture of this unnatural, I mean, this is not how conversations normally go. It's not normally scripted in this way, especially not only scripted in what words are said, but how it's going to fit in with her steps as well. I'm going to walk 2 yards, then I'm going to turn and say this. Anyway, it does draw attention in a different way. We've had attention drawn to the conversational conventions before. This, of course, was happening again and again in the Mad Tea Party back in Alice in Wonderland, and we already saw this beginning to happen as well here in Looking Glass Land among the flowers already. And with the Queen, of course, right? When Alice talks about losing her way and her words are literally seized upon, right? And so again, that unwillingness to sort of play along with idioms, with just like common figures of speech, right? By saying I've lost my way, she's saying something about herself. She's not claiming ownership over the ways, though the Queen, of course, herself is. Anyway, we've already seen some of that happening. This is sort of a different way to shine a light on the same kind of thing, I think. And it will be interesting to see how this continues to develop. We will get a bunch more of this kind of thing with Tweedledum and Tweedledee. So next week we will get more into this kind of thing. But 2 more quick things before we move on to chapter 3. What she predicts. So the landscape is set out like a chessboard, as Alice was observing, with the hedges being the vertical rows and the brooks being the horizontal rows. So you have to cross over the brooks to enter into a new square. And of course, since Alice is representing a pawn, she doesn't have to go through or over the hedge. She can't go through or over the hedge. She can only go straight forward towards the 8th square in order to become a queen. As, of course, the Red Queen here promises, it's all feasting and fun. And she tells her what she's going to meet. She's going to go through the 3rd square quickly by railway. And, of course, we know why. Because the first move of a pawn, they're able to skip the 3rd square and go straight to the 4th square. So Alice is going to be to move very quickly through the 3rd square. But there's something peculiar that happens there. Well, we'll get to it. But there is, as I say, there's something strange that happens in the 3rd square, which is chapter 3. And then, because it's the 4th square that belongs to Tweedledum and Tweedledee, the 5th is mostly water, the 6th belongs to Humpty Dumpty. Then the 7th square is all forest, and one of the knights will show her the way. And then in the 8th square, there'll be queens together. 4th Dauntless, I don't think Alice is going to be making any captures. No, because she's going to keep going straight forward the whole time. She's not going to go diagonally. Again, it doesn't seem to be that sort of chess game. Anyway, so one of the things that I think, is noticeable about how she emphasizes, how she describes what's coming. She keeps talking about these squares belonging to people. This fourth square belongs to Tweedledum and Tweedledee. The sixth square belongs to Humpty Dumpty. And that seems important, as the Queen was talking about how all the ways around here belong to me. All the ways around the whole board, right? She is the master of all the ways. She's a queen. She can go in any way that she wants to go. But that ownership of the squares seems to be, well, interesting. And we'll see how that ends up working out. Notice they are also alternating, right? We're not told anybody owns the third square, or the fifth square, which is mostly water, or the seventh square, which is forest. A knight will show her the way, but we're not told the knight owns it. And then there will be a communal situation in the eighth square, right, when there'll be queens together, and it's all feasting and fun. So we'll see. We'll see how that goes. But it's interesting to look ahead at how this is described, because we're going to see all of that and more as we move forward. But in the interest of that, let's move forward into chapter 3. At the beginning, as she's still on the hill and the Queen has left, she's looking down at the chessboard stretching out below her, and she notices that she can see, in the distance, she can see bees flying around flowers, is puzzled why she can see them so clearly when they're a mile away, and then she realizes that they're actually elephants buzzing around enormous flowers. And she has this peculiar moment. I think I'll go down and... No, I won't go just yet, she went on, checking herself just as she was beginning to run down the hill and trying to find some excuse for turning shy so suddenly. It'll never do to go down among them without a good long branch to brush them away. And what fun it'll be when they ask me how I liked my walk. I shall say, "Oh, I liked it well enough." Here came the favourite little toss of the head. Only it was so dusty and hot, and the elephants did tease so. Alice, upon seeing that the bees that she can see are actually elephants, her first response is delight, and she is eager to go and see the elephants for herself, right? The elephant bees and the flowers, which look like they must be the size of cottages with their roofs off, right, up on stalks. And she starts running down, but she immediately checks herself, which seems a conspicuous word under the circumstances. And it's not just that she suddenly becomes afraid. That's never said, right? She's turned shy suddenly. Seen from a distance, the idea of elephant bees, right, nosing about flowers the size of cottages, sounds curious and delightful. As she begins to approach it, as soon as she sets out and it becomes sort of real to her, she stops herself. It seems she turns shy. It seems that she's afraid. The idea of it is very attractive. The reality is rather alarming to get down there, right? That's already an interesting thing. We have not seen Alice respond much in fear. She didn't experience much fear in Wonderland, for instance, even when she was being threatened with execution on a regular basis towards the end. But here she suddenly is concerned about the elephant bees. I'm not saying I blame her for this, but I find that an interesting departure from Alice's character as we've seen it before. But there's more. There's now then another level of this. It's not just that she turns shy. It's that she tries to find an excuse for turning shy so suddenly. She doesn't want to admit that she is afraid. she has an inhibition, not just of going down among them. It's fear that is inhibiting her. I would think, it looks like fear is inhibiting her from going down among the elephant bees. But there's more than that. She doesn't want to admit. It's like she knows that somebody is watching her, right? And that she has to cover up. It's not only for her to construct this story for later, but it's as if she's being watched at the time. She is thinking about constructing the story later, isn't she? What fun it'll be when they ask me how I liked my walk. I shall say, oh, I liked it well enough. Only it was so dusty and hot, the elephants did tease so. So she is making up a script for what she will say to the people who ask her about her walk later. And she is, with her favorite little toss of the head, playing up the casualness of this, right? She's going to casually drop into the conversation. The elephants did tease so, like usual. She is building this little fantasy of relating the story to someone else, and how she is going to tell the story, even how she's going to comport herself and toss her head, right? As she's delivering this remark for maximum effect. So she's thinking about herself and how she will be perceived and how she will kind of shape the perception of herself. But she's also worried about perception of her in real time. She doesn't just have to come up with an excuse for herself. It's not just the internal division, wonder and fear, the desire to go and see and find out, and the shyness about actually approaching these enormous elephant bees. Now, First Fish, you're right. You are watching her. And that is exactly what strikes me. Notice what this passage does. Alice speaks a lot, right? I think I'll go down, and she's often talking to herself. But this passage all of a sudden raises the question, is she speaking to herself? She was speaking to, Alice has been alone the entire book, in the sense that she's not had any other human company. We saw her first speaking to the kitten and acting as if the kitten understood her and was responding. Then we see her going into Looking Glass Land and talking to herself, apparently, about that. And narrating to herself as she is going through, talking about wanting to go to the hill and not go back in the house. All of those lines from Alice have been just directed to herself. But in this passage, it seems suddenly possible, at least, that Alice is... it seems possible, at least, that Alice is aware of the fact that she has an audience. And that's a fascinating idea. That she is not... It'll never do to go down among them without a good long branch to brush them away, is the first thing she says when trying to find some excuse for turning shy so suddenly. So you might want a branch to brush bees away, right? I don't know how effectively that would work, but, maybe it would work. I don't know if that was a common practice if you were out for a walk. If you were a little girl out for a walk, and there were bees around, you might want a branch to brush them away with. You would need an especially long one to brush away elephants, clearly, right? Because they're so large. And she then convinces herself that she then convinces herself that it'll be fun when they ask me how I liked my walk. She's talking herself into it. She's talking herself out of her fear by imagining how she can I don't know what sort of like name drop this later on, right? How she can talk about how she'll be able to discuss this later on to her audience. Now, I'm not saying I'm necessarily convinced that Alice and Lewis Carroll are breaking the fourth wall here. Exactly. But I do think that Carol, at least, is sort of inviting us to recall that we are her audience. We are a sort of a stand-in for, and that she is thinking about audience, that she is sort of aware of this. So anyway, I think it's something to, this moment always kind of jumped out at me in some interesting ways. We'll see if we see some other similar things to this happening later on. Okay. She enters the third square and suddenly finds herself in a train, which is awkward because, of course, she didn't have an opportunity to buy a ticket because she is suddenly on a train. "Now then, show your ticket, child," the guard went on, looking angrily at Alice, and a great many voices all said together, like the chorus of a song, thought Alice. "Don't keep him waiting, child. Why, his time is worth £1,000 a minute." "I'm afraid I haven't got one," Alice said in a frightened tone. "There wasn't a ticket office where I came from." And again the chorus of voices went on. "There wasn't room for one where she came from. The land there is worth £1,000 an inch." So on the one hand, we have a very simple situation. She's being asked for a ticket. She doesn't have a ticket. She had no chance to get a ticket, right? To purchase a ticket because there was no ticket office. She's just suddenly appeared with no intermediary steps. So normally I'm going to get on a train there are intermediary steps involved. You don't jump straight from thinking one might be riding on a train to suddenly being in a train. Normally, there's like a platform involved, which has, a ticket office. In order to get on the train, you must first buy your ticket. There's a process, right? A multi-step where you go to the station, then you buy the ticket, then you go to the platform, then you board the train, and now you're on the train, right? There's a way these things happen, but we jumped straight through to that, right? We jump straight through from the notion of being on the train to being on the train. And so having skipped all of those steps, she, of course, doesn't have a ticket. So that's one thing that's happening here. We've skipped all these steps. There wasn't a ticket office where I came from. It's quite impossible for her to have, it's nonsense for her to be asked for a ticket when there was no possible opportunity for buying tickets. Meanwhile, the chorus of people on the train, the chorus of a great many voices, are offering a very different kind of reason, right? When the guard is looking angrily at Alice and saying, "Now then, show your ticket, child," he's showing impatience towards Alice. "Now then, show your ticket, child." The chorus ascribes a reason for this. And their reason is the value. It must be about the value of his time. "Don't keep him waiting, child. Why, his time is worth £1,000 a minute." So his time must be, if he is this impatient, his time must be very valuable indeed, right? So every minute that you waste of his is worth £1,000, which of course, remember, was worth a very great deal more back then than it is now. £1,000 is a very great deal of money. When Alice says, "I haven't got one," and there wasn't a ticket office where I came from, once again the chorus pipes in, again with another speculative reason. Why was there no ticket office where she came from? There must not have been room for one where she came from. And why would there not be room for one? Because the land there is worth £1,000 an inch. The land there must be so valuable that they can't afford to build a ticket office, and that explains why she doesn't have a ticket. So notice how the first thing that what we get here in this scene, as soon as she appears here in the train carriage, cause and effect goes right out the window. It would seem, and we get this strange overlay of conflicting reasons and interpretations, explanations of things that aren't explanations at all. Right? This keeps going. Alice thought to herself, then there's no use in speaking. The voices didn't join in this time, as she hadn't spoken, but to her great surprise, they all thought in chorus. I hope you understand what thinking in chorus means, for I must confess that I don't. Better say nothing at all. Language is worth £1,000 a word. That'd be a fun t-shirt, wouldn't it? Language is worth £1,000 a word. Anyway, I shall dream about £1,000 tonight. I know I shall, thought Alice. Okay, so she attempts to stop them. They're going to chime in with this strange explanation of whatever she says, right? So she refuses to say it. There's no use in speaking. There's no use in speaking if my words are merely going to trigger some kind of bizarre explanation that doesn't even make any sense in the context of what I've just been saying, right? So there's no use in speaking, but instead the chorus chimes in with her thoughts themselves. Better to say nothing at all. Language is worth £1,000 a word. I see exactly why you're not speaking, right? They have an explanation for that, and that it must be because of the value of language, right? Language is worth £1,000 a word. And Alice says, I shall dream about £1,000 tonight. I know I shall. Alice is predicting that this sequence is going to affect her dreams later that night. One thing that is happening here is merely dropping the seed of dreaming. Dreaming is going to come up more than once here as we go through. And certainly this segment begins to feel like a dream sequence, with one thing transforming into another and that kind of thing starting to happen here, which wasn't happening before. The talking flowers were one thing. The Red Queen and her strange sort of disjunction of words and things like that was happening there was strange enough. Now it's beginning to feel like a dream. And in that context, Alice is thinking about how her own dreams are going to be altered by this, right? How it's going to impact her sleep. I agree, forth Dallas, that cause and effect have been bent for a while and now they're finally broken, right? Yes, we certainly see some strange things happening with cause and effect here in chapter 3, right? While we are on the train. Notice, of course, the parenthetical. I said that that Alice wasn't breaking the fourth wall, but the narrator here does, addressing us directly, the readers directly. I hope you understand what thinking in chorus means, for I must confess that I don't. Notice the effect of that dash. If he had just stopped, I hope you understand what thinking in chorus means. It would be a little peculiar to do that, right? To sort of pause and to express something in a particular way, and then address your readers directly in the second person and say, I hope you understand what I mean by that. And that would be odd to perform that kind of a shift, to perform that kind of a statement in a story like this. But then notice how he twists it. by itself, I hope you understand what thinking in chorus means. My interpretation of that would be, I am attempting to convey this idea, right? I have this idea in my head. I am trying to convey it to you using these words. But I want to pause and check in with you. Do you understand what those words mean? Am I succeeding in conveying the idea that's in my head into your head by use of these words? That would seem to be what that first clause meant. I hope you understand what thinking in chorus means. But then the dash and then the twist. For I must confess that I don't. So he's not saying, I have an idea in my head, I'm trying to get into your head and I'm seeing if it worked. Instead, he's saying, I don't have any idea in my head at all. Do you know what those words mean? If so, can you tell me? Right? An even more peculiar thing for an author to do. Now, of course, remember when I'm talking like this, right, about words and things and getting ideas from one head to another through use of words, we should be remembering Jabberwocky and how that poem works, right? We've been prepared for this kind of thing. This book has been very interested in the relationship between words and things from when we first got into Wonderland, or into Looking Glass House. And remember, even beforehand, Alice's own love for pretending has already prepared us for this kind of thing, right? What is pretending if not disconnecting one thing with another thing, right? You might not be a king or queen, but you could pretend to be a king or queen or a hungry hyena, right? Normally, the noun hyena is not attached to the thing that is Alice, right? But by pretending, she can bring these two things together, even in ways which would seem to be logically incompatible, like her sister being one of them and her being everybody else, right? Her pretending to be multiple people at the same time. Lewis is here toying with us, going out of his way to toy with us and draw our attention to this indefiniteness, the indefiniteness of this connection between words and things. Yeah. Yeah, Mo Dillon, I can get behind that the narrator not understanding what it means suggests he's not creating but relating the story. Yes. And I wonder, Mo Dillon, if we can possibly connect this back to the previous slide when Alice, or not the previous one, but the one before, when Alice was thinking about other people's thoughts and reactions, how she would recount the story. She was going to be the storyteller when she mentioned, casually about how the elephants did tease so. Does that imply that she is the source of all of this? That all of this is her imagination, her pretending? What is our relationship with this story? Are we seeing it happen? Notice again, this is a kind of thing a story normally doesn't do. I'm reminded of the anecdote from the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings set. In particular, Peter Jackson's, was the Return of the King when they were doing Shelob? I think so. Yeah, it was. Anyway, the anecdote goes that one of the actors was asking where the light comes from in Shelob's lair, because you can see things, right? You can see Frodo, you can see the webs. What is the source of the light? Where does the light come from in that scene? And Peter Jackson's response was, the same place as the music. That's where the light comes from. In other words, you have to play along with the convention, right? You're hearing music, but there's no actual music there. You're seeing things in a place where you shouldn't be able to see anything, in a place where it's supposed to be pitch dark, right? And And again, the idea is we as consumers of stories, whether it's films or whether it's books, there are certain questions that we don't ask. There are certain things that we have to, by convention, take for granted. For instance, like who's narrating? How does the narrator know what's going on? When we're watching a movie, like we're watching a movie and we're seeing these two people speaking in private, how are we seeing this, right? By what through what aperture are we looking in on this conversation? The convention is that we're just sort of floating around and witnessing all of this stuff, and rarely is our attention drawn to the mechanism of how that works. It is sometimes, right? Again, just as when I talked about breaking the fourth wall in a play, same thing, right? We're asked to ignore the fact that what is happening is actually happening on a stage, and we're sitting in a crowd of people watching this stage. And Alice, the narrator here, is calling into question exactly this kind of thing. Like we're being prompted between here and the elephants moment, right? Our attention is being drawn to what exactly, what is this story that we're reading, and how is it being transmitted to us? The narrator, the storyteller, doesn't know. And there's even sort of another sort of overlay on top of this. That is, how is this book designed to be consumed? What is the way in which, what is the method by which this book is presumed, is sort of the primary method by which this book is to be consumed? It's to be read aloud to a child. We're told that in the poem at the beginning. And we heard that before, right? Exactly, fourth Dallas. You got a parent reading to a child. So the parentheses, is that the narrator speaking to us? Is it the parent speaking to the child? Is this a cue? Think of the Red Queen with her script, right? And then, but Alice was supposed to say something, and Alice was like, I didn't know I had a line, right? We're reading the story like Alice watching the script, and now suddenly we get it. Is this a line that's being given to us as readers, right? I hope you. So is the you not us as reader, but the you, the child that we're reading to, and the I, not the narrator, but us, the reader of the story, right? Is it prompting us to do a funny aside comment to the child to whom we're reading? It works on that level, right? And yet, at the same time, we are readers interacting with a narrative, with a narrator, and at the same time, we're being prompted to ask, what is the relationship between the narrator and Alice, between the narrator and the content, as the narrator is saying these things and admitting that he doesn't understand what he's saying. It's not his words, not his story. You see how delightfully meta this story is. Through the Looking Glass is one of the most self-aware kind of meta stories that I know of. I mean, what Lewis Carroll plays with here is throughout this book is just amazing, just hilarious. But let's keep going. Okay. But the gentleman dressed in white paper leaned forwards and whispered in her ear. By the way, the gentleman dressed in white paper, another very dreamlike element. Nothing is explained about that, right? We're given no reasons for this. Why is he dressed in white paper, and what's he doing on the train, and where is he going, and any of that, right? No gesture towards any explanation, towards any reasons at all are given here. There is so much that seems to be perfectly random in the train. That is, things happening without reasons. But the gentleman dressed in white paper leaned forwards and whispered in her ear, "Never mind what they all say, my dear, but take a return ticket every time the train stops." Indeed I shan't, Alice said rather impatiently. I don't belong to this railway journey at all. I was in a wood just now, and I wish I could get back there. You might make a joke on that, said the little voice close to her ear. Something about you would if you could, you know. Don't tease so, said Alice, looking about in vain to see where the voice came from. If you're so anxious to have a joke made, why don't you make one yourself? Whew, okay, again with the meta levels. Alice rejects the kindly advice of the gentleman dressed in white paper. Remember that everyone's yelling at her about how she doesn't have a ticket, and telling her what she ought to have done, none of which pieces of advice make any sense at all. And he leans forward and confidentially whispers in her ear, reassuring her, never mind what they all say, my dear. Right? JJ, I've been operating under the assumption that the gnat's name is Arthur. Anyhow, okay. He leans forward confidentially. The my dear, right, indicates, sort of affection. And like he's obviously on her side. He's not just yelling at her like everybody else. And he gives her the advice, take a return ticket every time the train stops, right? So at every stop, buy a round trip ticket. And she impatiently rejects this. Indeed, I shan't, right? That is nonsense. That's the worst kind of overkill. That's not how you do it. You don't buy a new round trip ticket at every single stop of the train. Indeed, I shan't. I don't belong to this railway journey at all. She now points to, with all of these nonsensical things happening, that is, all of these things which don't seem to have a proper cause, all these effects that don't seem to have a proper cause, she points back to the root of the problem. I don't belong to this railway journey at all. I never got on this train, right? I was in a wood just now, and I wish I could get back there. Notice, by the way, this is her wishing to be in a place, again, like she was wanting to get to the hill. And she couldn't do that unless she turned around and went back in the other direction than the one that she was wanting to go in, right? Remember the inversion of her will and her direction back in the garden. So she seems to be in a similar kind of place now, except notice the irony, she wants to go back, right? And the rail, the train is inexorably bringing her forward, but she wishes she could get back there. This is where she's interrupted by the gnat again, this tiny voice from near her shoulder, so close to her ear that it actually tickles her ear. And she says, don't tease so. Just like the elephants. And of course, now notice the irony here. She was going to just casually talk about the elephants teasing so, as she related this story later on. And in fact, what she's being teased by, that is buzzing around her ear, what she's being teased by is not an elephant, but a gnat. Not the large thing that she was afraid of and thought she might need a very large branch to brush away, but something so small that she can't even brush it away. She can't see where the voice is coming from. Okay. But then we have the joke. The voice is advising her that she might make a joke on her wish to get back to the wood, saying that you would if you could, you know. A pun on WOOD and WOULD, on her will and the wood. You would if you, something about you would if you could, he suggests she might make a pun. And Alice asks the sensible question, if you're so anxious to have a joke made, why don't you make one yourself? The gnat keeps doing this. It keeps suggesting puns, suggesting jokes, but not making them himself. Except that one point later on where he kind of accidentally makes a joke and then says, I wish you had said it. Right? What's going on here? So on the one hand, you've got everybody yelling at her about what she ought to have done in order to have a ticket. And the gentleman in white paper is giving her this sort of final piece of nonsensical advice. The advice that she's getting from the gnat is how she might make a joke of it, how she might take the thing that she said and turn it into saying something else. Now, there are two ways in which this seems quite relevant to the stuff that we have been seeing. First, the whole point of the joke is simply the pun. What is a pun? See, Arthur, this is finally the book for you, right? What is a pun? Why is a pun a joke? What is funny about puns? Well, it's all about the connection between the word and the thing. The joke of a pun is the ambiguity, right? The ambiguity of you've got a word, but that word, that sound that has come out of your mouth, that you have shaped into this word, points ambiguously in two different directions, or points in two different directions at the same time. That play of meanings, that the one thing you've said could mean this and it can also mean that at the same time, would and would. There's no difference in how you say it, but a big difference in what the meanings of those two words are. That's what puns are. That's how puns work, right? So again, it's about how do you puns point to a challenge, a problem, an opportunity, right? An intrinsic element in language that you have some indicators, right? Sound combinations, right? Morphemes, words, which point in more than one direction. And you can only understand which one by context. But you can make a joke on it. That is, you can take it and you can deliberately shift the context in order to make a pun, in order to make a joke. That's why it's funny, because you're taking the word that points one way and you're deliberately moving it into a different context, right? It's that juxtaposition of those two. That's funny, right? That's why it's funny. So again, it's about the nature of words, their connection to things, and how language works. That the gnat here is specifically drawing attention to. But now there's more to it as well. There's also the whole cause and effect thing. What is the response? What they're saying doesn't make any sense. She is still responding. Alice is still responding to these things with logic. Indeed, I shan't, Alice replied. Alice said rather impatiently. No, of course she's not going to do that. That would be silly. That would be nonsense. It's nonsense to take a return ticket every time the train stops. That's a silly thing to do. There's no reason to do that. It's not logical to, just because you're on a train and don't have a ticket, to buy, 15 tickets. Totally unnecessary. That doesn't make any sense. She is still wanting everything to make sense. And the sort of counter advice of the gnat is that instead of making sense, she should be making nonsense. Puns are nonsense, right? It is taking a thing which is a sensible thing to say and turning it into a nonsense thing by substituting the one meaning for the other meaning, right? That seems to be, in some sense, what the gnat is here sort of suggesting and how it relates to what Alice is talking about. She doesn't get it. If you're so anxious to have a joke made, why don't you make one yourself? But again, what she's not seeing is that, again, the gnat is advising her, just as the gentleman dressed in white paper was advising her. And she's rejecting all of those things. Okay. Anyway, she does. The train goes to jump over the brook. This is the part that I don't understand. The train goes to jump over the brook, and then she finds herself off of the train with the gnat, who's now the size of a chicken. So no problems with the not being able to see it anymore, and it no longer has a small voice, indicated by very small typeface in my edition, which I represented on the slide there. But she seems to have gone backwards. The third square is the one she was meant to take the train through, because she was going to spend very little time there. But then she wanted to be back in the wood. And when she jumps over the brook, she should be in the fourth square, which is the one that belongs to Humpty Dumpty. So maybe she's on the edge of Humpty Dumpty's square here, that she has, in fact, entered the fourth square. And I guess she's going to come across signs to Humpty Dumpty, but there's, not to Humpty Dumpty, I'm sorry, Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Humpty Dumpty is 6, Tweedledum and Tweedledee are 4. But anyway, so she must be in the 4. Either she's, the only reason I question this is the whole going forwards and going backwards and the going towards the hill and turning around and going into the house. She was just wishing she could go back to where she came from. And then, she has all of this land to traverse. But she doesn't cross another brook before she gets to Tweedledum and Tweedledee. So I guess she must be in the fourth square by now. Anyway, here's the gnat still. And she's having a conversation with the gnat about insects. And the gnat asks the lovely question, what insects do you rejoice in? Which I love. For Thoughtless says, wishing you could go back should send you forward. It may well have done, right? It may indeed have had that effect. Alice explains she doesn't rejoice in insects at all. So here she's insisting on the meaning of that word, right? Because I'm rather afraid of them, she admits. At least the large kinds. But I can tell you the names of some of them. Now, of course, here's Alice showing off her learning, as she has been wont to do, especially in Wonderland. Of course, there's a kind of delightful irony here. I'm rather afraid of the large kinds of insects. What kinds would those be, Alice? Maybe if you encountered an insect, I don't know, the size of a chicken, would that count as a large insect? Unless it's a very small chicken indeed. Yes, it would. So by her own argument, she should be rather afraid of the gnat to whom she is speaking. But she doesn't seem to be. But I can tell you the names of some of them. Maybe it's because they were already friends. She had already been conversing with this. She'd already been conversing with these. No, she wouldn't be afraid of a human-sized caterpillar with a hookah, Fourth Dauntless, because that's not an insect. Quite different. But now that you mention the caterpillar with the hookah, notice how much deeper the issues are here in Through the Looking Glass. Alice kept growing and shrinking, and we were looking at in Wonderland, and we were looking at the ways in which that kind of mapped onto, growing up, to become a grown up, right? To become a big girl. A question of how big a girl she was becoming and all that kind of thing. And there were some times in which like names were called into question, like whether she was a girl or a serpent, for instance. But cause and effect, she didn't understand the cause and effect. Like she didn't know what would cause certain things. Like she didn't know what would cause her to shrink and what would cause her to grow. At first anyway, right? But once she figures that, and the cause and effect don't work the same way as in our world, right? But once she figured out like each side of the mushroom thing, when the caterpillar told her that, then she had it worked out, right? And she was able to make herself grow and shrink at will by nibbling on one or the other chunk of mushroom, right, to control her own size. What's going on here is something quite different from merely there is cause and effect. It's just not the same. Like the things that cause particular effects aren't the same thing. The kinds of effects that can be caused are quite different than we normally see in our world, and the things that cause those effects themselves might be rather strange, right? But here in Looking Glass World, there is a much deeper issue with cause and effect, right, than that. Again, it's like causality itself that kind of gets called into question. But anyway, she's going to tell the gnat the names of some of the insects that she knows. And the gnat remarks, of course they answer to their names, the gnat remarked carelessly. I never knew them to do it. What's the use of their having names, the gnat said, if they won't answer to them? No use to them, said Alice, but it's useful to the people that name them, I suppose. If not, why do things have names at all? I can't say, the gnat replied. Further on in the wood down there, they've got no names. However, go on with your list of insects. You're wasting time. You're wasting time, the gnat says, though it was the gnat that went on this name digression. Okay. The gnat immediately calls into question the relationship between names and things. Alice knows the names of insects. Oh, so do they answer to their names? If that's their name, they must answer to their names. That's what names are for, right? You call somebody's name and they answer to it. What's the use of their having names if they won't answer to them? No use to them, but it's useful to the people that name them, I suppose. Why do things have names at all? Alice asks, and that indeed seems to be exactly the question. Why do things have names at all? What is the connection between a name and a thing? You've got the thing's name from its perspective, the name which is connected to the creature's self-awareness. That's why people answer to their names, because they know that name means them, that when you say, my puppy has figured this out, right? When we say this combination of sounds, our puppy does not, I believe, speak English, but when she hears this particular phoneme, she comes, right? She does, in fact, answer to her name. So there's a kind of self-awareness there, right? That word means me, and so therefore I respond to it. That's one sense of the word name. But sometimes names can be external, right? The name can be entirely external, a name that's applied to things with that has absolutely nothing to do with their own sense of their identity, with their own self-awareness at all. So these two different perfectly normal functions of names are being kind of brought together like the gnat. Notice how that's almost exactly like a pun. These two ideas of names, of the concept of naming, right, are being brought together and juxtaposed. Of course, the answer to their names is almost the gnat making a pun again. It's not literally a pun, but it's conceptually a pun in that way. And it's a pun which not only, like by that act itself, calls into question the sensibility of words, Remember the dictionary that the Red Queen brought up. But also now is calling into question the very attaching of words to creatures, right? The idea of naming things. Why do things have names at all? I don't know. And then he mentions, okay, yeah, so there's a wood where they've got no names. There's a place where nothing has a name. So what does that mean? How does that work? Well, we'll get there. Crawling at your feet, said the gnat. So we get several looking glass insects. This one is my favorite. Crawling at your feet, said the gnat. Alice drew her feet back in some alarm. You may observe a bread and butterfly. So Alice has just talked about how there are butterflies in her world. And he says, here's a bread and butterfly. Its wings are thin slices of bread and butter. Its body is a crust, and its head is a lump of sugar. And what does it live on? And what does it live on? Weak tea with cream in it. A new difficulty came into Alice's head. Supposing it couldn't find any, she suggested. Then it would die, of course. But that must happen fairly often, Alice remarked thoughtfully. It always happens, said the gnat. I love this book so much. Okay. First, without even commenting on it, the gnat is drawing attention to having first called into question the purpose of names and how names are applied to things. We then get Alice giving three... Wait, what's the first insect she says? Horsefly. Right, yeah, first so we get a horsefly, and then we get a dragonfly, and then we get a butterfly. Those are the three insects that Alice names. And you see the subtext of this list. Here are three different kinds of fly. Horsefly, dragonfly, and butterfly. Three different kinds of fly, which in their names are associated with three other things. One fly that is a horse in some sense, another fly which is a dragon in some sense, and then another fly which is butter in some sense, right? One connected with butter, one connected with dragons, one connected with flies. And perhaps there is a way in which that makes sense, those connections. But even if there are connections between those flies and the other part of their name, horses, dragons, and butter, at the very least, it's not the same connection, right? The logical principle the principle underlying this name, why it is that name in particular was applied to this creature, is kind of challenged by the parallelism, right? These names, which would all be in the dictionary, right, and therefore sensible, are not actually very sensible. Notice that our further attention is drawn to this by the more literal connection between the looking glass insects and their names. There are butterflies in our world. In Looking Glass Land, there are bread and butterflies. Why is it called a bread and butterfly? Well, that's perfectly obvious. Its wings are thin slices of bread and butter. Its body is a crust, and its head is a lump of sugar. Right? Its insect is a walking tea party. Right? So of course it's a bread and butterfly. What else would you call it? The insects, the looking glass insects, are literalizations in some sense of the thing that they're connected to, drawing attention to the fact that, of course, none of our insects work that way. Howsoever the horsefly might be connected with horses, it is certainly not because it looks like or is made out of horses. You look at that fly, you wouldn't know it had anything to do with horses. Nor would you think that a butterfly has anything to do with butter, or a dragonfly necessarily with dragons. So again, the relationship between names and things is being brought into question. But notice again, it's not here the looking glass creatures that are strange. It's a strange creature, but it's only strange because it makes sense. because it is, in fact, there is a direct literal connection between the name and the thing. Is this what names are for? To describe something exactly? But now there's another cause and effect question that Alice immediately brings up. She's been asking what they live on. First, there is the assertion that it is. The gnat is pointing to their three examples. You've got the horsefly in our world, the rocking horsefly in Looking Glass Land. You have the dragonfly in our world and the snapdragonfly in Looking Glass Land. And here, of course, we have the butterfly and the bread and butterfly. And the gnat is pointing them out. They're all standing right around, right? So the first assertion is that this is. The bread and butterfly is. But then Alice asks, but how does it go on being? What does it live on? How can it survive? What is the cause that brings about the effect of its continuation and presumably propagation at some point? Why, that is to say, in a sense, why should it be? So what does it live on? Weak tea with cream in it. On the one hand, that makes perfect sense. The tea, of course, was the only thing missing from this, buzzing arthropod, right? Arthropod? Yes. I sometimes get arthropods and anthropods mixed up, but they're quite different. This buzzing arthropod tea party, the only thing that was missing was the tea, right? It's got the bread and butter, it's got the lump of sugar. It doesn't, all it's lacking is the tea. And now it is reunited with the tea, right? When it is brought together with the tea, it continues, right? Now you have a tea party. If you get weak tea with cream in it, which I'm going to go ahead and guess is probably the kind of tea you would give to a young child, then the bread and butter fly is happy, right? This is the fulfillment of its being, to be united with weak tea with cream in it. But Alice immediately thinks of the problem. It's not going to often stumble on weak tea with cream in it in the wild, now is it? That is, if the way by which the bread and butterfly continues to be, right, if the cause of the effect of its continued survival is the finding of weak tea with cream in it, what would happen if it doesn't find any? Well, I think she suspects, and the gnat confirms it. It would die, of course. If it doesn't get what it needs to survive, it will certainly perish. Without weak tea with cream in it, the bread and butterfly will certainly die. By the way, this also, you're unlikely to find your bread and butter without your tea, right? But anyway, it would die. And Alice remarks thoughtfully, that must happen very often. I mean, there's not much weak tea with cream in it just lying around in the woods. And the gnat says, it always happens. No bread and butterfly has ever actually survived, despite the fact that there's one sitting right there. Where did it come from? How did it live, right? The delightful, when the gnat follows the line of Alice's cause and effect questions. How does it live? What does it live on? And how does it get what it lives on? And of course, the answer to her inexorable cause and effect questions is it can't get what it survives on. And so it always dies. No bread and butter fly ever survives. And therefore, it is nonsense that it should exist at all. The combination of the acknowledgement of cause and effect reasoning right? The following through to the bitter, indeed in this case, bitter end of the cause and effect reasoning on the one hand, and the absolutely cheerful blank denial of it, right? That the cause and effect reasoning leads in the end to perfect nonsense. If it always happens that the bread and butter fly dies, how is there a bread and butter fly standing here, right? We see both of these things at once, both the insistence on cause and effect and the complete disregard of causality as well. And Alice is invited just to accept both of those things together. She's not told, what does it live on? Oh, it doesn't work that way, right? Or what happens if it couldn't find any? Well, I don't know. Like the cause and effect is not backing off from that cause and effect, just ignoring it completely, simultaneously. Okay, so much going on here. Man, I could think about each of these things for like hours. Oh dear, and I have. Okay, well, all right. Let's stop here. We'll stop here after the bread and butter fly. We'll get to the wood with no names next time, and then we'll get into Tweedledum and Tweedledee. All right. Thanks everybody. Thanks everybody for joining us. Joining me tonight. We'll be back next week. We will get to Tweedledum and Tweedledee, so make sure that you go ahead and read chapter 4. I was going to say, I love the Tweedledum and Tweedledee chapter, but that's pretty much true of every chapter in the rest of this book. I mean, man. But keep in mind, as you're reading the Tweedledum and Tweedledee chapter, remember Alice and her relationship with poetry in the previous book, right? In Alice in Wonderland. How she kept reciting poetry and the poetry kept coming out funny, right? It didn't come out when it came out, it was altered, right? It didn't work the way that it was supposed to work, her recitation. Remember that and watch what happens with poetry in chapter 4. We'll be talking about that some next time. All right. Thanks, folks. I hope you're enjoying this book as much as I am. Such deep stuff, man. I'm telling you, this book is addressing some deep issues as you give a nighttime reading to your child. But anyway, thanks everybody. Good night, and I will see you guys next week. Bye now.